Hello and welcome to the University of Salford's programme as part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science, which this year has a very special theme around COP26. And this event tonight is the first of two events that takes place as part of a review of each week. So we have a review of week one tonight, and then the following Monday, you can join us again at 5 p.m. to talk about week two. And the purpose of these sessions is to really talk about the contribution of the social sciences to the climate issues that we talk about over this week. At the University of Salford, we have a program of activity taking place every day where we talk to people that are in Glasgow, talk to different research experts about climate change, and you can join us at 9 a.m. each morning to talk to those experts. Now, we have very special guests joining us today that come from a range of perspectives in the social sciences, and we're going to kick off by talking to them about their perspective and reflections on COP26. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome in Maz, Sharon, Sarah, and Steve. Good to see you all here.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
This is a really special session for me because I think it's a wonderful way for us to respond to COP26, to get into some of the topics and to really think critically about what's going on, because we see so much in the news. And of course, every day there's some new controversy around it as well. Greta Thunberg declared COP26 a failure on Friday. So I wanted to start off with a bit of introductions and to hear a bit about your reflections. But if you are joining us and you haven't seen anything in the ESRC Festival of Social Science, what we're trying to do is bring you insights from the social scientists to a whole range of different subjects over the festival. And tonight it's climate change. So Maz, I might just kick off with you. What's your sense of things so far? Tell us a bit about yourself and what you've been noticing at COP.
Sure, my name is Maz Hardy. I'm based at the Business School and the Advanced Research Computing Group at the University of Durham. So, COP26, interesting. My sense is there's been a real shift actually through the week in terms of the cascade of messages that we're getting. And now it seems to be that we're starting to get more familiar from a social science perspective in terms of the indirect health consequences that are kind of threatening to unravel, decades of progress around, pollution, quality and environment control, food security in particular. So it seems that the social issues are really starting to take hold now. And for reasons like this, social scientists like myself are getting really interested in health community strategies. And certainly one of the areas of research I've been looking at is households. So how households in particular can respond to climate change and kind of the jargon around that. So I think we're seeing, I have to say, I do agree with Greta on Friday. This feels disappointing, to put it mildly, in terms of what's going on with COP26 and where we're being led by, public health organizations and medical professionals. But I'm hoping there will be kind of a deepening of the understanding for where change needs to be at a societal level, at a social level, and particularly at the household level that I'm interested in.
That's great, thank you. And Sharon, I know you were in Glasgow last weekend and had a sense of things actually on the ground. So tell us a bit about yourself and your work, and again, your perspective on COP26 so far. Is your sense that the social issues are becoming more prominent now?
Well, I think social issues definitely are becoming prominent, and they should be prominent, I think. According to my impression back in Glasgow when I was there were people from all over the world that came and even walked across Europe for days and days and days and days and weeks to be there, to bring the voices. There was a fantastic program yesterday by Extinction Rebellion, where there was an activist from Argentina and an activist from China coming and bringing the voices of their populations and the struggles that they face to COP. Well, of course, Extinction Rebellion, not in the main doors, and that's one of my impressions that I got, is that a lot of what is discussed at COP excludes and silences the voices of minoritized groups that don't have a seat at the table and that could actually not only be represented, but actually teach us we could learn from them, and we're losing an enormous opportunity to learn there.
I think that certainly today in the news, there's been a lot of talk about the populations who are actually at COP and those that are missing. And it's clear there are a lot of people missing, and a lot of representatives from industries that are missing too. And so I think thinking about how COP may need to be reimagined in order to bring about major changes is certainly something that's come out of a lot of the discussions I've seen. So how does your research, Sharon, sort of touch on this area? Where do you sort of see your entry into it?
Well, I've been interested in media coverage of climate change for decades, I'm afraid. And then I've looked at how people make sense of this media, of this news on climate change. So obviously, all the literature shows, we can see now that obviously coverage increases exponentially when there is a major political event taking place. So this is when we are going to see a lot of studies looking at how do media talk about climate change, how are we talking about this emergency, and how are we making sense of it as readers as well, readers or consumers. I don't particularly like that word, but you know what I mean. And obviously, I've also done research on how to promote environmental behavior. And obviously, for example, at Salford, I collaborated with Ian Drum, and we used the Energy House to study whether we could develop an augmented reality environment to help people make more environmental choices in a physical place. So this is going to be part of the future and part of the solution.
Yeah, certainly. And I think part of that is about really embodying and living through climate change. There's been lots of discussion about climate change not being something in the future for many nations, but actually something that's very much here already. So Sarah, tell us a little bit about your research and what you do and how you're seeing things go down at COP so far.
Well, it's been quite interesting. My research, I work with the Think Lab on the Transcend and the Mobilize project, and we're looking at simulation models for supporting climate change and disaster risk management. And there's been quite a shift, and my role has been, and my research has been basically on socio-technical aspects of addressing climate change. So it's quite interesting to see what's going on at COP26 now. It is interesting and at the same time a bit scary, to be honest, from a human point of view. I do find that the voices that should be there, as Sharon was saying, are not there, and you can see that from the speech from the PM from Barbados. For so far, I think it was one of the most interesting ones from my perspective, in terms of Mia Motley really put the finger on it in terms of what we should be considering, or what the nation should be considering, and actually the voices that are quite affected physically now and socially are not represented there. And this is also seen in, not sure if you've seen the picture of the Tuvalu Prime Minister also speaking to, and that's quite a powerful image to look at and to think, that's a statement just on its own about someone that should be there and should be represented there, because they are quite affected by it. And the power of leadership that I see, that everyone who is there is trying to fight for the leadership of the conference. So that's been quite interesting to see. We've been discussing this for more than 30 years, and I think that the social sciences definitely have a key role to play. And Al Gore also mentioned that in terms of the justice that is underlying in all this climate change, and this is actually quite a big and a serious issue. And how can we support that? You know, the technology is not developed yet. People are doing what they can on the ground. I've worked in populations in Vietnam where they dealt with the floods on their own accord, even though policies are in place, but they are not bottom down. So populations just do what they can under severe circumstances. And I think this is that's the layer that it's kind of missing and that social sciences can support with. That's from my perspective. It's been really interesting, but I fear that there's so much more to do that we can do. And it's this collective approach that I think that needs to be embraced in a more generous manner, if I can say so.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And obviously sociology and the social sciences have done a lot over the years to talk about underrepresented groups. And Steve, coming to you now, I mean, these are sort of key themes in sociology. How are you seeing things at COP? Tell us a bit about your work and again, your reflections on COP as you see it so far.
Okay, well, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to this. I'm going to start to say some scary things. I'm interested in, my background in terms of my research is in this field called social epistemology, which is about the social foundations of knowledge. And it's not just empirical, but also normative in terms of where do we go from here. And in recent years, I've been very interested in the future of humanity and the extent to which the human should be a kind of defining value concept, because we have various alternatives on the table. And in a sense, COP26 illustrates this insofar as humans are both the cause of the problem and potentially the solution, but the extent to which the humans ought to be so much the focus is also up in the air. Okay. Let me make two observations. I just flew in last night from Germany, where I'm at a research institute this year. First of all, the fact that this is in the UK, I think, in a way, it skews the media coverage in a way, because this COP is 26. I think people are getting a bit bored in other countries, or at least a bit skeptical. And of course, because it's here in the UK, there is a lot of coverage. And in a sense, all of the kind of, environmental and climate issues that have been around for a while get galvanized and sort of focused here, right? But I do think that in other countries, this is not quite covered with as much concern as it is here. Okay, that's the first point I would make. I don't know how much. I mean, the way I look at this, to be honest with you, is in terms of what the end game is, right? Where are we going to? I mean, are we going to have a COP27, 28? Right. Already, the environment minister for this country has lowered expectations tremendously, it seems. George Eustice. I mean, I don't know if you saw in terms of the idea of bringing people back to the table to renegotiate what their, what their climate commitments are. He says, no, that's not going to happen. Whatever ends next week is pretty much the way it's going to be. And so we're going to just keep on going like this. And I mean, I could say I actually do have some things to say about what I think the end game is, but maybe we should leave that for later.
Maybe, yeah, it sounds very intriguing. This, I think, definitely gets.
Yeah, because I've been thinking about what the end game of this is. Are we just going to keep on going with COPs forever, right? Until that 1.5 kicks in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an important point. And I guess then, just to add, perhaps, Steve, what do you think then the social science brings to this table?
Conceptions of what the end game is, to be perfectly honest. No, seriously, I teach a course here at Warwick, even though I'm in Germany at the moment. I'm still doing the lectures online on the sociology of end times. What does the end look like? Okay, and we can get into a discussion about this, but I think this is a reasonable thing to be talking about.
Yeah. Maz, I might bring you in here because I think obviously a lot of the stuff we talk about is around tech. We hear a lot about technological solutions, and often we hear about that to the exclusion of the stuff that people would actually think is more urgent, like changing a bit of the social structures as well. But how do you see things sort of play out in terms of this trajectory that we're on, I suppose, where Steve mentioned we are sort of endlessly having COP after COP. At the moment, it seems the aspiration is to get anywhere near what Paris achieved, but obviously, one would hope to go further than that.
I think we're at a key pivotal point where there's a sense of fatigue, even boredom, anger, and frustration around kind of the endless point of the end game, as it were, for the COPs, but also the sway to where the responsibility lies. And we've talked a little bit about sort of the leadership involved with COP26. and the lack of diversity there. But it's really problematic when we think about the leadership roles. So who's in those leadership roles? Why? And who's in the junior roles too? And there are many issues with that, but one obvious one is, the lack of diversity even at the level of gender, for crying out loud, and the impact on women in particular, women and children, is, in terms of natural disasters and climate breakdown, is 14 times more than men in terms of how they will be impacted by those kinds of decision makings and what happens in the future. So I think, oh gosh, lots of things going on in terms of where the personal responsibility lies. Our kind of, up to now, our blind faith in sort of technology to sort of help us along and to save us. And perhaps we need a new way of looking at what those solutions might be and how we bring those forth, because those technological changes, those technological revolutions either need to hurry up, but also need to happen in such a way that they don't create new climate issues. So then we are forever in the loop of Steve's forever COPs. So it's really problematic. So we're dealing with social change, and we're dealing with very reactionary issues as well. But at the heart of this lies representation, really, which is where I think sociology comes in at its strongest.
Definitely. Steve, I'd like to bring you in, and then Sharon.
Okay. It's interesting about what Matt said about the technology stuff. I think actually part of also what we need to do, and this is where sociology can also be helpful, is in terms of revising our understanding of science. Okay. So Greta Thunberg did this piece, this column in The Guardian over the last couple of days. Some of you may have seen, right? And it was very powerful with regard to the presentation of the climate change data, in a sense, all the symptoms that something needs to be done. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that she also said in the column, which I thought was completely wrong, was science doesn't lie, right? And there's a sense in which too much of the moral force here in this discussion rides on science, right? As if science were God, as if science was going to save us, and all we need to do is to pay attention to the science and everything else will follow from that. And it seems to me that unless we can get over that problem, okay, because I do think it's a problem, it's a misunderstanding of science. Science does not function this way. And I would have thought that as a result of the COVID pandemic, people would have learned this. Yes. Right, where you basically had scientists in all these different countries, all of them very respectable, right, and working from the data. And because of the political situation, the cultural situation of the various countries in which COVID was manifesting itself, different policies were made, right? And it wasn't that the science was lying, or anything like that. It's only that the science can only tell you so much, right? At the end of the day, it's an issue about values. And a lot of the conflicts and disputes that we're seeing, right, between the richer and poorer countries and all the rest of it, right, are in a way the usual political economic problems, right? They're in a sense, climate change just becomes an opportunity to rehearse and to reformulate a lot of the inequalities of the world that have already been existing, and and in fact end up making the poor parts of the world more vulnerable basically to anything that happens, regardless of what causes it. Okay. And so the problem is that, because so much of the rhetoric that comes from the environmental movement is science-based, right? It hides behind science because they have no real political front. They have no real political kind of vision in a way. So science becomes the proxy. And that's a big mistake. It seems to me that's a really big mistake. And it's a fundamental failure of the environmental movement to have, it seems to me, because it ends up, let's put it this way, it just doesn't, it doesn't work. And sociology can tell you that.
Mm. Sharon, I want to bring you in here, but just before we do that, I was reminded of at the start of the week, you may have seen that on YouTube, there's been lots of live sessions from COP as well, to the point of actually disorientation. It's really hard to find the good stuff. And I remember seeing one of the streams that was preceding a discussion about sort of changing industries. And the entire thing looked like basically advertisements for these new companies that are coming along to save the day. And I think that's one of the problems we have, is that this sort of replacement of existing industry with new companies feels like a lot of what COP is about, positioning emerging new technology companies or new energy companies into a new zone. But Sharon, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, and I agree completely with you. I think there is a fundamental difference between science and technocracy. So I think what Greta was trying to say, and I tend to agree with, is that if the vast majority of scientists agree that we're facing a problem, and that problem is humongous, and we need to do something about it quickly, otherwise we are in big trouble. We need to listen, and they're not lying. That there is a big difference between science and belief. I don't like to use the word believing, because I did a paper in which I showed that that's a way to undermine climate change. So I don't want to use that word, but I don't have enough vocabulary. But it's like being persuaded by the fact that science, there is a consensus in science that tells us we are destroying our planet. We are killing not only ourselves, but also other creatures that have no possibility to answer or to do anything about it. That's different fundamentally from technocracy. That is, therefore scientists should be in charge. They should make all the decisions. We should, as a society, abandon every responsibility and give this responsibility to scientists. That's a completely different pair of hands as far as I'm concerned. And I think is only when you understand that science is a language, or that's the way I see it. To me, science is a language to describe reality, and there are different languages to describe reality, and the truth comes from a combination of the different languages, and learning to speak and learn from each other, speak to each other and learn from each other. I think that's the only way forward. And I was recently at the International Council of Psychology in online, a conference online, and funny enough, they were talking about the importance of climate justice, number one, and I was on a panel on that, but also importantly, they were talking about the importance of decolonizing our curricula. That means decolonizing our way to understand reality and our way to make sense of our subjects, whatever subject we are in social science. And I think, again, that doesn't undermine necessarily the veridicity of what you do in science. It does delimit its, establish its boundaries.
Definitely. And certainly over this period, the COP26 Universities Network, of which we are a part, I think most universities in the UK are part of this network now, but a lot of discussions have taken place around how we reframe curriculum through the lens of climate change. But Sarah, I want to bring you into it, and then I think it's Maz and then Steve.
I think I have two mindsets, two opinions about both subjects. One is this, I'll start with the one that you picked up on last, which is the decolonization of the curriculum, which I think it's something very sensible, and it's who is responsible and who is doing that and who is involved. Because if you have the same people that wrote the initial curriculum to try and decolonize it, that won't work. It's like a mathematical equation for failure. So that is a very sensible issue that we've been discussing for quite some time, and this attached to climate change actually has a big impact, and needs to be, if it's going to be done, it needs to be proper consideration, not as a ticking box exercise. That would be my take on it. And so far, the ticking box exercise is what I've been seeing.
Yeah.
The second part is this idea of the technology in society. And I think I like the word transformation. And we've seen that even to ask people to wear a mask to save lives was during COVID was actually not fulfilled. So if we need people, and we need all of us together on this climate issue, we need a transformative process in some way so that we address the inequalities that this brings and has brought. This is not something that it's coming up. This is happening already quite heavily. And especially in third world countries, which are fighting. And women and children are actually the most affected by this, which is awful. And it will perpetuate itself through first world countries. That's not going to stop there. So I think that this hasn't been approached in COP26, at least not to the extent that we like these transformative processes in terms of looking at climate change. And the decolonization of the curriculum will come under that umbrella. How exactly, I'm not sure. But I have my doubts, but I also have my hopes, which I think we all do when we look at this thing. But this will be my take on this first initial thoughts about this idea of all for technology, but technology people-centered, with people to develop it. So
thank you. Yeah, Mass, over to you as well. But tell us what your perspective is.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on where Sharon was kind of being self-reflexive about the language that she was using, and she's right. Language does matter. So when you were both talking earlier, Andy, you mentioned, sort of it felt like I suppose a monologue of adverts in some of the COP sessions, and Sharon, you were reflecting on, well, I don't like to call them consumers, but ultimately we're dealing with consumers here. And that's kind of the point that we're at now. COP26 seems to become a big commercial vehicle, for want of a better word. And we're situated not as a public, as a social public, but very much as consumers, which is where the language matters. And when we start to pick up on your thoughts around, transformation, Sarah, I'm with you in terms of hopes for how we might decolonize and kind of reclaim even language around this, and how we might put together education about this for ourselves, but also future generations. But that's got to go beyond this tick box exercise, this very kind of tokenistic contribution that we currently have, I fear, in that, decolonizing the curriculum has just become another commercial product, another commercial vehicle within, the education system. Actually isn't really giving us the change that we need, whether it's technological, people, social, whatever it is. And I still think we're dealing with a lot of, deliberate jargon around, how we introduce these new ideas and what actually is going on the ground, within the conversations, within the agreements around COP26. And it's interesting to see that I think it's the New York Times they have an interactive page you can go on to kind of cut through the jargon, and they give you geoengineering, electric, whatever it is, the latest buzzwords are, carbon capture, and explain what each one is, and kind of how it relates back, and whether it actually sort of will do what it sets out to do, or whether it really is jargon for jargon's sake. So yeah, I'm hopeful too, kind of, but yeah, as Steve started, scared actually. This is is serious, and it's nice to have a conversation about it, but my blood pressure.
Steve, over to you.
Well, I want to return to the issue of science here, because it relates in a sense to this business about seeing all these different companies proposing all these so-called green solutions and trying to make a quick buck out of it. I think we need to be careful in terms of what we mean when we talk about science here, because in a sense, I can understand why this kind of thing that Andy began with, right, all these different companies kind of positioning themselves would make sense. Because look, we think about I think we need to talk about two different aspects of science. The data part, the sort of thing that Greta, for example, likes to focus on, I don't think that's contestable, really. I think the data is pretty secure. However, in a sense, that's just the beginning of science, right? That's, in a sense, just the basics. I mean, where the real science, where the scientists get involved, as it were, is with the modeling, right? And the modeling have to do with the theoretical assumptions, with the parameters, right? And again, I would have thought COVID would have taught us this, right? Because it was all about competing models, right? People were working with the same data. The data wasn't the problem, right? It was the models. And in a sense, these technological solutions, in a sense, represent different modelings of the same data. And then they try to, turn it to their advantage, right? And so this is why science isn't the savior here. Science, in a way, is the playing field, right? Science is the playing field, right? And the data provide, as it were, the sort of the boundary conditions, you might say, that you have to play around with. And then how you project the future is up to you and who you can persuade to do it. And that's where all that technology stuff comes in, right? I mean, and so it seems to me this is the way to look at the situation, right? And that's why, people who prefer certain kinds of radical technology solutions like geoengineering versus ones who prefer more conservative ones, they're looking at the same data, but they're modeling things differently. And then, they're coming out with a kind of proposal. And I think this is, at the end of the day, going to be an issue about values, right? And about politics, right? And about power. And in a sense, science is just a playing field. Right. And that's what makes it kind of, interesting. And it makes it kind of people, it makes it in a way easy for people to position themselves because the data points are kind of clear. Right. But it isn't going to be solved by science. This is the point.
Well, certainly over the last few months here in the UK, we've seen a lot of discussions in the context of COVID where many of the leading scientists have said it's not enough to say we're being led by the science. Understand the complex territory that the science occupies is crucial. Sharon, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I find it quite interesting the parallel between saying the science is the data. Well, I respectfully disagree. The science is not the data. The science
Tell Greta
is the process.
Tell Greta that. This is the point. Tell Greta that because she thinks the science is the data.
Steve, please
But
don't
she's
interrupt.
12.
No, sorry. But that's the point.
No, I'd say my piece and then you can.
Sorry. Okay. I just want to. I'm sorry, but I do think that's important here.
No, I don't care. To be honest, I care. I'm saying my point first.
Go on, Sharon, you go for it.
And for me, the thing is, the models are used also in science to show that there is a trend, there is an increasing trend in temperature. We are the anthropogenic role or nature of climate change has been shown for decades with modeling. So I find it problematic to attribute to modeling the problem. Modeling is one way, and I agree, there can be different models. You can, I do regressions for breakfast. So yes, of course, you put different predictors, you get different models. However, again, the technocracy is a different thing. The fact that different companies are trying to demonstrate that their solution is particularly effective is a different thing from the science that Greta is talking about. Greta is talking about the science that demonstrates that there is an objective problem when it comes to climate. The climate is changing and it's due to human activity. And that's grounded on models, not only data.
So, thank you, Sharon. Sarah, I know you want to come in here as well.
Yes, I think the point I would like to make is that data can be used and looked at from different perspectives and not just from modeling. And I think this is one of the big issues, is that when we overlap the data and when we see the data and interpret data from different perspectives, that's when we can get potentially a clear picture of exactly what we're talking about in all the fronts. Because it's easy to say that it's 1 point something or that this is affecting A, B, or C. But then what are the implications of that? The data will also show, but we need to see it from different perspectives. and from the different values that the scientists have, which it will be beneficial to look at and to explore together, and not just looking from one discipline's perspective or from one science perspective. And I think this is the key shift in the transformational process that can make the difference. For that, there are a number of things that are required. One of them is that people actually accept that for a start, I would say. But because even now we got quite heated just on this little small minutes of conversation of looking at data from different perspectives.
And heating up is, of course, the theme of COP, which is true here as well. And we've got one question that's come in. It's a two-part question, which I wanted to show you both parts, because it's a topic that I think the question is correct. It's not really come up as a topic, but the question is about sustainable population growth. We've sort of seen a lot of taken for grantedness about the idea that the population is rising globally and it will continue to rise. Not much pushback against whether in fact that should happen or whether in fact it's just inevitable. But I suppose one of the questions we ought to face is whether in fact population growth is compatible with the sorts of aspirations that we have in COP and indeed around climate change generally. We talk about 10 billion population coming just around the corner, it feels like. So Maz, I might come to you on this first of all, because I think it's the sort of thing that is not talked about too much at COP, because obviously you also get into them. Well, how do we change levels of population in different countries from around the world? It's incredibly complicated. So what's your sense of this?
I have a really sinister experience of this, actually. I was on a climate protest in York at the weekend, and being handed out there were leaflets about population control to women and young girls concerning their roles and responsibilities within that. And as you can imagine, probably don't need to go into detail as to what those kinds of leaflets said. And it did strike me that those leaflets are also being handed out primarily by men. So this... Gosh, we're in hot water again, aren't we, in terms of talking about contentious issues? This is nice. My blood pressure feels
great.
Just
like to do.
I mean, in terms of the message that we're being given at the moment, not only are we in a fairly dire situation, but pretty soon the resources that we have in order to solve the dire situation will also run out. So, how we come together and how we talk about this, I think, to give it a bit of a wishy-washy answer, falls back onto, Sarah and Sharon, your point as well, about this isn't just being, one discipline's sort of problem to solve. This is all of us sort of trying to sort this out together. It's not just the science, it's not just the sociologists, but actually we need to have a way that we can have a similar language around this, but also start to, put in place where the responsibilities lie, and some of that is about how we overcome distrust with our leaders, because I don't know about you, but from a personal level, I don't hold much faith in what's happening in terms of the leadership at the moment, and certainly don't trust that to carry us forward in a way that will be sustainable. The other thing, just to go back to what you were talking about before in terms of where the statistics and the data is taking us, what will be interesting is what happens to the legacy of the COPs, I suppose, that are already in existence, and sort of the microcosm of sort of data and conversations around that, because even 5 years from now, those will provide, I suppose, a very chilling narrative as to where we will be. I feel unsettled.
Thank you, Steve. I know you want to come on this population question.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when David Attenborough was a reasonably young person, and he was calling for zero population growth back in the 1960s. And actually, if you go back on YouTube and listen to some of the things he was saying, because he was always some kind of environmentalist. But environmentalism, as you know, goes through various fashions, depending on what the data, you might say, but I think models say. And he was calling for people to stop having kids. And the point was, back in those days, so we're talking about the late 1960s, early 1970s, people were projecting enormous figures going forward, given the current population growth rates. They didn't happen. Even though that was the best science of the time, it didn't happen. And that's why people aren't talking about population growth now as one of the issues. It's rather a consumption issue, okay? It's a consumption issue, and that, and so it goes back on the capitalist table again. But I think it is worth pointing out, given what we have been saying about data and science, if we go back 50 years ago and listen to some of those guys like David Attenborough, who's still alive, right? They were saying totally different things about what the future would look like. And they were saying cut population, but people aren't saying that now. And I think that ought to be a kind of lesson as we think about going forward, how in fact the science can change our policy orientation.
It's interesting. I've seen a lot of discussion over the last year or two about different sectors and how they're responding to it. I remember it was a couple of years when Vivienne Westwood launched a new line of clothing and did a promotional campaign where she said, "Don't buy my clothes." And it was all about trying to minimize the amount of clothing that we buy. At Salford University, I see the student union set up a swap shop where people can just swap their clothes with each other so that they don't have to purchase things. And there are sort of new economic models around this, I think, emerging. Sarah, I know you want to come on this a bit as well.
Yeah, I think this issue that Steve was mentioning about the growth of population, actually, we didn't have to do anything. COVID took over. And for many politicians, what they wanted was actually for it. The only reason why we're not having a different conversation is because of the NHS in numerous countries. Because otherwise, we will be having a totally different conversation from this one. And COVID could actually change the data completely.
Yes.
So these predictions and these things, if the world has a tendency to also react to things, doesn't it? And COVID has changed those predictions also, and changed massively from the previous ones, even though I went to the report from the World Bank, and they still predict that we will be growing in cities in terms of 80% of our population. So are we what are we doing about that? I don't think it's about having children or not having children, but
well, this may lead nicely into a question we've got from Luke, who's joined us also online, and it talks a bit about that global picture. And we know that there's been lots of discussion today, of course, Barack Obama talking about the absence of China and other countries that are not here at COP, but which need to be. And I guess it goes back to then, what is that sense of a global community that really exists around this problem? So Luke asked whether, in fact, China could do more here. And obviously, I think lots of people think that they could. But I suppose when you look at it from a matter sort of climate justice, do you think that there's a sense in which many countries are, in fact, not able to go further in their commitments, or indeed feel that there is a sort of historical injustice that is being corrected by the slowness of their pace? Steve, I might come to you first on that, given that the question was relating to something.
Yeah, because he means something different from what you've just raised, I think. I made a point last year when in May of each year is the Chinese Communist Party conference. And May of last year was probably when this whole COVID thing was really at its most dire moment. What I suggested back then was that China could take an enormous lead in terms of making what I take to be the inevitable green economic transformation. Right, because China is probably the best positioned country to make the kind of massive industrial shift that is required because of the way in which the state and the corporate sector are so intimately connected with each other, and of course the overall size of the economy and the fact that it's ascendant. And so if China really wanted to be the global superpower of the economy, right, during the peak of COVID, when everyone's industrial output was down in the normal carbon area, right, this would be the time for China to take the initiative and leapfrog, right, by basically pushing forward a really strong green initiative, which would catch everyone in the back foot, right? Because this kind of massive green initiative that's required is not going to happen in democratic countries, because of the disaggregation of the political and economic sectors, right? It's always going to be this kind of bullshit that we see, right? And it's going to kind of go on forever. And we just hope, we're still around for it to go on forever. But China could do something. And especially when the industrial economy was down, and it didn't. This is the point. It didn't. It might still do so in the future. I recommend it to the guys in Beijing. This is what they should do, but they're the ones who are best positioned to make the great leap forward.
Aaron, I know you want to come in on this too.
Me? No, I wanted to come on the previous one. I completely agree, though, on what Steve said. I think China, India are in very powerful positions to make a difference, and I know from what I was listening yesterday that there is a strong movement, a pro-environmental movement within China that is demanding this. Unfortunately, not only don't they get their voice heard within their own community as much, but also we don't get to hear about it, and we live under the impression that China the big polluter and everybody says yes sir and don't do anything about it. But the truth is that there is a movement in China that recognizes the important role that China can play in saving the planet, and they are demanding it. So there are people, we need to be on their back. We need to help amplifying their voices.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, speaking of amplifying voices, I think one of the things I feel listening to lots of the presentations at COP, especially obviously in the science sort of sections, is that there are lots of scientists who bring a lot of social science into their work without necessarily acknowledging it. People that do a great number of studies where there are social scientific methodologies in place. But I wonder, coming to you, Maz, perhaps thinking about how we teach social sciences in a whole range of educational sectors, do you feel that there's enough, I guess, insight from the social sciences within natural physical sciences? Do you think there's a presence there that needs to be sort of addressed, really?
Oh, good question. Oh, hello. I've got a little person joining me. One moment. Hello.
That's the future.
Yes, you can have a cuddle. I think the short answer to your question is kinda. Let me give some context to that. I work in a business school, and I do feel a bit like a lone sheep sometimes because business schools do need sociologists. And yes, we have discussed and are putting in practices too, as we talked about earlier on this, to decolonize the curriculum, but actually having a fundamental understanding of what that is, what that actually means for our students and how we implement it at even at a process level is being missed. I'm not saying sociology has all the answers, but having that different perspective as a sociologist is very helpful from a business context, and to extend that further into other disciplines, into science itself, would be useful too. I think crucial to how we, well, I want to sound a bit naff and like a Marvel comic, but we need to change and indeed save the world here. That's what we're talking about. So yes, is the answer to your question. More sociologists in those science disciplines and indeed business disciplines and others. Yeah.
Well, certainly, Sharon, I saw lots of, one of the presentations I saw during COP was, in fact, someone speaking specifically to how do we address the perspectives of skeptics versus deniers, and what are the different strategies we need to employ to nudge people in certain directions. And I guess out of your background, do you see that, in fact, if we are much more, I guess, knowledgeable about behavior change and about how communication can affect behavior change, that we can steer people towards the beliefs that underpin this aspiration for change that we see around COP?
You see, I have a fundamental ethical issue with that. I really don't like the idea of nudging people in doing anything. I find it quite... I know it's controversial. I know it's not popular, and I know I'm getting myself into trouble, but that's what I think. And that's the truth. I think as a scientist, as a psychologist, as a social psychologist, what I am trying to do is to make sure people have the necessary information to make their own decision. I don't want to nudge people. I want the truth. And I know that's where I was coming from when I was saying, let's be careful here when we're talking about science, because I am worried about the denialist position, and that's where I'm like, if we are too relativistic and we tend to say, oh, everyone does their own thing and science doesn't count anything and it's just data and whatever, everybody does what they want with it, then we run the risk of feeding the denialists. And that's where I am worried about. But I told you, I think in an interview last month, that I don't believe in objectivity either. I don't believe objectivity exists. I believe that there is only many subjectivities and that the truth comes from bringing together the many subjectivities. And this, the scientific community that doesn't lie. The single scientist doesn't lie either, as far as I'm concerned. It's just that looks at things from their own perspective. And we need everybody's perspective to come together. And that's where there is a problem, I think. If we pick out the one person that thinks in a different way and we give it as much media coverage as we do the 98% of scientists that all agree climate change is anthropogenic, because that gives people the impression that the two are equivalent. That's not nudging. Saying to people, look, this is what the science says, and those two people who disagree, it's interesting to look at why they disagree. There is always something to learn from the different perspective, and you can correct your models, you can incorporate things, but it's a completely different pair of hands for me, I think.
Steve, you want to come in on this too?
Yeah, I mean, in response, nudging might be the best that we have in democratic societies, okay? Because if we believe that this climate change crisis is indeed a crisis, we've actually been doing kind of what you want, namely different countries bringing their different perspectives, trying to talk to each other endlessly, and it gets nowhere, okay? I think we can all agree on that too as a data point. And so if you don't go for the nudging route, which would involve incentives and, all this other kind of stuff, playing to people's interests and all that, then what you've got left is compulsion, right? That you force people to do stuff. And this is where China comes in, right? Because in a sense, China, in a way, because it is this kind of coercive society with a lot of power, does have a lot of leverage potentially in a situation that otherwise is completely rudderless. Right? It isn't going anywhere. I think we're all granting this. So I do think, insofar as we really do believe this is a crisis, and time's running out, what's available? It's either nudging or compulsion.
I mean, I think partly being able to understand where nudging is already happening and affecting people's behavior, whether or not it's the scientists doing it, is one component here. Because if you are on Facebook and you read certain news, then those are the news that are going to come to you even more than others. And I think that aspect of being nudged a certain way without even perceiving it is a big part of that media culture that we live in here at the moment. Sharon, I'll come back to you quickly.
Yeah, I think there are other alternatives. It's not only either nudging or compulsion. You can create an environment in which, for example, you tell the truth. I know that's a rare thing that we don't like to do, but, we might start from there and trust that people have a brain. And when they are faced with certain situations, they are capable of making the right decisions. And we've seen it in COVID. We've seen it. People, the governments did what they did and what they wanted to do. People did what they believed was healthy and safe for them. And we've seen it. Yes, there is people who have got together, helped each other, created communities, supported their neighbors, their dear ones, etc., etc. and that's as real as it is, the few people who did not wear masks and didn't believe in vaccination. I mean, we get a lot of media coverage of those cases, but statistically, they're not a majority; they are a minority.
Yeah. We unfortunately are running rapidly out of time, and it's no surprise that we end up in a conversation about how social change actually occurs in a conversation about social science and climate change. But I wanted to give both Maz and Sarah a chance to just have a final word as well. So Sarah, over to you first.
I think it's very interesting, and I really had a really interesting time now with everyone and listening to. I'm an architect and I'm a urban planner by background. So I've worked and facilitated numerous teams in different fields. So I find it fascinating to look at this, and especially the ideas about data and about truth and people beliefs, because even in science, scientists have their beliefs based on their assumptions, on their data. So that's another thing to consider. I still think it's a collective effort, and it needs some more graciousness in terms of how we look at each other and how we look at how all of us are addressing this. It's very easy to point fingers, very, very easy. Sorting out things and trying to find solutions is the biggest task of all. And we in this case, we do live in democratic societies, although I think China could be definitely a potential candidate. Although I'm still waiting for that, Steve. I will wait for that one, to be honest. But yes, thank you very much. Very insightful, and looking forward to have this discussion in another circumstance, hopefully.
Yes, thank you. Maz, over to you.
Very quick comment before I'm interrupted by Bounce Patrol. So we've talked a lot about kind of the social consequences, and we're just starting to get into truth. And indeed, I can see that we're kind of question next to what is truth, which is great. In terms of, some thoughts around where we might be nudged, it's really interesting to see sort of the trickle-down effect into sort of cultural stuff, for want of a better word. So I jokingly mentioned Marvel earlier, but we have a lot of superhero narratives at the moment, and kind of save the world narratives, and that's really interesting. And even in the context of Bounce Patrol down here, we're looking at rhyming around environmental words. So those nudges don't have to be necessarily majorly overt, but can be quite discreet as well. And yeah, let's just hope that we get there before we completely lose control of the situation, or have to watch Bounce Patrol forever.
Well, thank you, Maz. We have reached the end of this, unfortunately, but it's been great to have you all here talking about this subject. I think one of the challenges we have is, in fact, making sure that people hear a lot of what comes out of the social sciences in these conversations, and partly bringing it into the curriculum elsewhere is something that we can do really well. But we have another one of these taking place next week, next Monday at 5 p.m. But in between, there's also a series of events that take place as part of the Festival of Social Science, where some of these issues we'll get into even more. We have a film screening taking place tonight at 7 p.m. and tomorrow night at 7 p.m., which is connected to Motherload, the movie discussion, which takes place on Wednesday. So if you want to see a vision for an alternative local transportation system, then this film is for you. So please do join us for some of those sessions going forwards. And thanks very much for your participation. Thank you. It only remains for me to say thank you to Steve, Sarah, Maz, and Sharon for this incredibly lively conversation. And indeed, I think a great statement of what the social sciences can bring. So thanks so much. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Very
you.
nice.